Alright guys, I'm going to go over the solution for high score. As always, what you want to do is start with the README file, and I have it open here at the bottom. So, high scores. Manage a game player's high score lists. Your task is to build a high score component of the classic Frogger game, one of the highest selling addictive games of all times, and a classic of the arcade era. Your task is to write methods, and as you guys know, methods are just another word for functions that return the highest score from a list. So already you know you're going to be working with lists. The last added score and the three highest scores. So you need to return the highest score from a list, the last added score, and the three highest scores. Already you know you're working with lists, and you know that you're going to have three methods or three functions that you have to write just from this paragraph. Okay. In line 7 it says, in this exercise you're going to use and manipulate lists. So again, if you didn't get that we're going to work with lists from the first sentence, or the first part, you get it here. Python lists are very versatile, and you'll find yourself using them again and again in problems both simple and complex. This is true, which is why we spent a lot of time talking about lists. And there are links, if you guys forgot, about how lists work. There are links to how lists work, data structures, lists and tuples, and there's a link to the Python documentation. There's a link to realpython.com, and there's a link to developers.google.com. If you forgot how lists work, okay? The bottom of this is basically the same as usual. We just have some information about how to run tests. All right, so the next thing you should do once you understand that you're working with lists is to go over to the code, and I have the code already opened up. Let me minimize this, in Thonny. Probably use Thonny for these challenges, because as we found out, running the tests, they don't come out properly, or they don't come out well. It's not really clear to read the tests. You can read them, but you have to scroll up a little bit. The tests run a little bit better in Thonny. So actually I'm going to run the test here. So I have high score, empty document that you guys got to fill in with your code, and the test script. So I'm going to run the test script without changing it. And you can see in this test script, there are 7 tests. Of course, we're failing all of them because we didn't change any of the code, but you can already see what sort of things are being tested and what is being expected. So right now, we're not returning anything. This test is expecting 190 and 70 for this test. You can scroll up here and see all the different tests. And as we add code, we're going to jump back and forth and test to see if we've passed any of the tests, if we're getting closer. So another way you can test is in the terminal. So I'm actually going to open up a terminal, and I will make the text a little bit larger so you can see it. I'm going to cd into the directory where I have these files, these 3 files, the README, the test script, and also the file that you're supposed to edit with your solution. So I have it in our projects, challenges, because I have all the challenges, and cd 3 score. Okay, so this is directory. I have all the files. If I in here run Python 3 and then high score tests, I'll get results very similar to what I get inside of Thonny. But there's a tool that you can install on your computer called PyTest, and you can install this by using pip to install it. It's really useful for testing code when you have a test script, so I'm going to do that. I'm going to type in sudo pip3 install.u pytest. This might take a minute to install. Okay, I type clear here. Still have those three files, and this PyCache was created when we ran the test. So we can actually, I'm actually going to remove that, so you can just see the 3 files. All right, so the 3 files are here. If we type PyTest, now that we have it installed, -v, which will give us verbose information. Type in highscore_.test. Okay, now this will print out information that is a little bit more, it's color coded, so you can actually see at the bottom here that we ran 7 tests and 7 failed. It actually gives you the name of each test. And here you can see what the test was expecting and what it got back. And it says none does not equal that. So that's why we got a failure. And you can go up and see each test. The test name is up here. This is the code that we ran for the test. You don't have to understand this. What you really want to see is the thing highlighted in red. What it expected. In this case, this test expected our solution to return a 30, and it got nothing back. And again, because we haven't edited anything. Okay, so you have 2 ways to test your script. You can either test it inside of Thonny, just running the test script. And let me just close this. Or you can use a terminal, use pip to install PyTest and run PyTest with the test script. And that will give you a little bit more information, and it's more color coded, so you can see exactly why things failed. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the code and we're going to start trying to solve this. All right, we have three functions already set up for us. Latest is probably the function that we need to return the latest score. If we go back to the README, again, we are doing your task is to create write methods that will return the highest score from a list, the last added score from a list, and the three highest scores from the list. So latest is at the top, so we can start with that one. All right, so the latest score from a list. Here's our list that will be sent to us. It's called scores. It's the parameter that we're setting for this function. There's no reason to change that. So what we're going to do, we're going to get the last, say we get the last score, okay, and from the list. You guys were taught how to get the last thing in a list. So if we say the list is scores, and we want to get the last thing in the list, if we're trying to get the last thing in the list, I showed you guys how to do that. And I can remind you of how to do that inside of Mu. So I'm going to have Mu open here, and I'm going to just open up REPL. I'm going to create a quick list. Say my list is going to have the same name. Say scores, okay? Will be the name of the list. And if I have, say, 100, if it's a list, we have to have brackets, okay? So 100, 30, 50, 80, and 700, okay? Those are the scores in our list. We have the list. If I want to get the first thing in the list, I say scores, or I want to reference the first index, the first thing in the list. So we have scores. Index number is 0. That's how we get scores back. If I have scores and I want the second thing in the list, I need to put a 1. I showed you guys how to get the last thing in the list. You can say no matter how long the list is, because this only has 2, 4, 5 things in it. But if we had a list of scores with 500 scores in it, we should still be able to get the last thing. And the way that we get the last thing is by typing in the name of the list. In this case, the name of the list is scores, and -1 to get the last thing in the list. If we wanted to get the second to the last thing in the list, it'd be -2. Okay? Again, if we type out scores, you can see -2 is the second to last thing in the list. Scores is the last thing in the list. If we add something to this list, if we say scores dot append, and we add, I don't know, say 50 to the list, this is now what the list looks like. So now if we type in scores -1, the last thing in the list, when we get the last thing in the list will now be 50. So that is what we get returned. Okay, so it's really that simple to solve this one part of the solution. So if we type in, we create a variable called last score, and we say scores is -1. We get scores -1, and then we return last score, and we save it, and then try to run the test. That should help us at least a little bit in passing on the test. And we see already that we only have 6 failures now. We ran 7 tests, and we only have 6 failures now because one of the tests is to test the last score, and we already solved it, okay? So let me close the shell, and go back here, and let's keep going, all right? Now, we want to get the personal best, so the top score. If we go back to our README file, down here, we want, your task is to write methods that return the highest score from the list, the last added score, which we already did. We know that it works because we passed that test, and the 3 highest scores. So personal best is going to be the highest score, all right? So if we want to return the highest score, how do we find out what the highest score is? Again, this is something that I taught you guys as well. If you have a list that is not ordered, and you need to know where things are in an ordered way, what you need to do is sort it. So this list that we have right now inside of REPL isn't ordered. So if I type in scores, you can see that it's not ordered. To order it, I showed you the method that is attached to all lists, which is called sort. So if I say scores, sort, now scores will be sorted, okay? Now that scores are sorted, we can just get the last thing in the list, just like we just now did, because now that scores are sorted, the highest thing in the list, or the highest number in the list, is the last item in the list. So let's go back over to Thony and just do that. So we can say scores dot sort, and then we can say we want the best, just create a variable called best, is scores -1, just like we did before, okay? Now that we sorted it, we know that the last thing in the list is the highest thing in the list because we sorted the list. And if we say now that we want to get the last thing in the list, we can store it inside of the variable called best, and we can return best, okay? So if we save this, go back, this time I'm going to run the test in the terminal, okay? And we run PyTest -v, we'll see at the bottom here, 5 failed and 2 passed. We can see which ones failed here. So now we've passed 2 of the tests, okay? Just by doing that simple thing, we've passed 2 of the tests, Okay, all right, so almost 2/3 of the problem already. The last thing that we need to do, according to the README file, is to return the 3 highest scores. Okay, all right, so how do we do that? 3 highest scores. Again, we don't know what order of the scores we're going to get, so we need to sort the list, right? So we can start off by doing something similar to what we did in personal best. All right, so if we say scores dot sort, we'll sort the list just like we did in personal best, so we can get the 3 highest things. Then what we can do is return the 3 highest things. Now, we talked a little bit about this in class, but if you had forgotten, and I mentioned this, and I could have mentioned this earlier, if you've forgotten at all how lists work, you could just go to the cheat sheets that we provided to you. So I have that open in the Google Classroom. So you can go with the long one, but the information that you need here is in the short one too. So we already know how to sort a list. But if you didn't remember how to sort a list, that information is in the cheat sheet right here. To this section of the cheat sheet, and this will tell you how to return more than one thing from a list. So all the information that you need for returning more than one thing in a list is here, but it's also in the longer cheat sheet. So if we go down to the section on list, so in the section on list, it reviews everything that we talked about in class, and it also gives you more information if you wanted to learn more about lists, to do things, even things expanded above what we talked about in class. So in this section, you can see how to get the first thing on the list, the second thing on the list, the last item in the list. So if you did not remember what I demonstrated again in this video, you could have gone here to get that information. You could also, from here, learn how to get the 3 last things in the list. So this is how you get the 3 last things in the list. This is how you get the first 3 items in the list. So first 3, you would put the name of the list. So that if this was our list, this code is how we would get the first 3 things in the list. This code is how we would get the 3 middle items in the list. So this list, as the example here, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items. To get the first 3 items in the list, we have the same brackets as we usually do, and we have a colon and a 3. So we get the first 3 items in the list. So it will get 0, 1, 2, and then it will stop at 3, similar to how the range function works. Okay. Now, if we want to get the middle of the list, we'll start at 1, and it will return 1, 2, 3, and it will stop at 4. Okay? If we want to get the last 3 items in the list, similar to if we were trying to get the third last thing on the list, we'd use a -3. So we use a -3 here, and we get -1, -2, and then -3. Okay? All right. So with that information, what we can do is jump back over to Thony. We can use that information to help us start to solve this. So if we solve this and we have the list, we need to get the last 3 things in the list, because we know that we sorted it and the highest scores are now at the end of the list, right? So we want to get the last 3 things in the list, right? At this point, this is what we're thinking, okay? So we get last 3, and last 3 is going to be scores -3, okay? All right, scores -3, but we can't just do -3 because -3 would just return the third to last thing. We have to put a colon in here, okay? That will return the last 3 things in the list. And now, or that will get the last 3 things in the list. And now we can actually return the last 3, okay? So now if I save this and I run it to test to see whether or not that will solve our problem, or solve our problem and pass all the tests, we can see whether or not that passed all the tests, okay? All right, so we got 4 failures now. So that passed a little bit more of the test. If you remember, if you go back over to terminal, we had 5 failures and 2 passed. So why is it still failing? We can go up and actually see, okay? And it might be a little bit better, easier to see where the failures are in the terminal, or it might be easier for you to see where the failures are in Thony, whichever works best for you. So I'm gonna see where the failures are here inside of Thony, and as we keep working, I might jump back over to the terminal. All right, so this is what it was expecting for this particular test, and this is what we sent over. Okay, we definitely sent over 3 things, so we know that at least that part of our code is working. We sent over 3 things and not 1 thing, but it was expecting 40, 40, 30, and we returned 30, 40, 40. Okay, So it's expecting us to return the list of the top scores in reverse order. So it wants the highest score first, and then the second highest, and then the third highest. In this case, the second highest is the same as the third highest. But it looks like if we go up and we can actually look to see the other test that failed. Here, this is what it was expecting, 100, 90, and 70. And what we returned was 70, 90, and 100. So if we go back to the README file, we could have actually figured out that that's what we wanted, right? Because it says it wants the three highest scores. And usually when you're listing things out, the three highest scores, you want them to list of how they're the highest, right? So what the highest is first, and then the second highest, and the third highest. Because we sorted the list and we have all the highest scores at the end of our list, we are returning them in the wrong order. So what we need to do is figure out how to return them in this order, in reverse order, so that the highest is at the front of the list, and followed by the second highest and the third highest, all the way down. Okay, you can see all the if we go up here and see the next test that we failed, we can see it again. What it expected was 30, 20, 10, and what we gave it was 10, 20, 30. All right, so we have to do a little bit more coding to solve this problem. But I think now that we've figured out why it's failing by using the test script, we can make a couple of adjustments here. So there are a couple ways that we can do this. Now you can jump back over to the cheat sheet to get some hints about how to reverse this. Okay, so we're going to jump back over to the cheat sheet. We're still in the section about list. And now you can read through this, and you can, and right here on this page, you can see how to reverse a list. So it actually tells you a couple of ways to reverse a list. You can use the sort and reverse it. Okay, you can say sort a list, and you can use the reverse true. That will give you a list permanently reversed, or you can use .reverse to reverse the list. Either one of those would work. You could also use the function called sorted to temporarily sort the list. So this will sort the list temporarily, and you can also do a reverse. Okay, so either one of these would get us to our solution. There are lots of different ways to solve this in Python. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to reverse sort the list first. So I'm going to say I want it sorted in reverse order. That will give us a solution that we want, but we need to make a change, right? If we reverse sort it, so if we go back over to Thonny and we say, as it says here, reverse equals true inside of our sort, say reverse equals true, and we save this, this is closer to the solution, but it still won't give us what we want. The reason it won't give us what we want is because now if we reverse the sort, now the highest numbers are at the top, at the beginning of the list instead of the end of the list. So if we try to run the test, and actually I'm going to run the test in the terminal again using PyTest, you can see that 2 failed and 5 passed. So we're closer, right? Only 2 of them failed. But here you can see what the problem is. We got 190 and 70 is what we were expecting, and what we returned was 10, 10, and 0. Now that's not even close to what it was expecting. And the reason that we got why these 2 things failed is because we are still pulling from the end of the list. Remember, with this right here, we are pulling from the last 3 things in the list. Now that works if we have a short list, and apparently that worked, and that was fine for 2 more tests that we could pass the last time. But it doesn't work when we have a very long list. When we have a very long list, and you can see here, this is the list that they're sending us with this test. This list is very long. So if we're trying to get the last 3 things on this list, it's not going to be anywhere near the highest scores if we have it sorted in reverse order. So what we need to do, if you've forgotten already, back in the cheat sheet, we are pulling the last 3 things. We need to pull the first 3 things, and if you've forgotten, it's in the cheat sheet. This is how we get the first 3 things. So we're getting the last 3 things. We just need to change our code here to get the first 3 things. So after the colon, put a 3. This will get the first 3 things in the list. We save this, and now we run the test rather. We'll see, ran test, okay. All the tests pass now. All the tests pass now because we're getting the first 3 things in the list. And after we reverse sorted it. So it's sorted in reverse order with the highest number first, second highest number second, third highest number third, and all the way down to the list. So if we go back to PyTest and we can run it here, we'll get the same result, okay. All right, we show you when your tests are passing, you can see each one that passed, okay. We passed the test that was testing the latest score. We passed the test that was testing the personal best. Top highest score, highest to lowest, 3 from a list of scores, and all the other tests. We passed them, 100% pass. Now it works. Now this is an acceptable solution. However, it's not the best solution. It's a little bit more typing and a little bit more code than is necessary to solve the solution. If you don't need to create a variable, you shouldn't create a variable unnecessarily. Okay. In this case, we're creating variables unnecessarily all over the place. Okay. So what we can do instead of creating a variable here in latest, we can just return the last thing. Okay, on the scores list. So instead of creating a variable, we can just say scores. Okay. There's no reason to create a variable to do that. We can just return the last thing in the list to get the latest score. All right. Similarly, after we sort the list, there's no reason to create a variable called best. We can just remove this variable after we sort the list, remove this variable, and just return the last thing in the list, because the last thing in the list will be the highest score, okay? Now, we are reverse sorting the scores, and then we're saving it in a variable. Again, this variable is not necessary. We can just return the first three things in the list. After we reverse sorted it and we know that the first three things in the list are going to be the highest scores, we can just return that without creating a variable unnecessarily. Okay? You don't want to create variables unnecessarily because they take memory, and you don't want to use more memory than you need to when you're writing a program. Okay? So if we save this and then we run the test again in the terminal, so we saved our code, we'll remove the unnecessary code, run it, still passes our test. Now, you can make this even simpler. The way that you can make this even simpler is if you do the research about lists, okay? This is not something we went over in session, but as you become a programmer, you're going to learn that you need to do your own research to learn more about the language, because you can't keep all this stuff in your head. And this is one of the skills that you need to learn when you're a programmer is to research things. So if we look, so you could do a Google search for how to return the highest number in a list in Python. You just write just that into Google. Actually, I guess we're opening up DuckDuckGo. So you have an example here that is very similar to our example, right? We have a list as this example. We sorted it and we got the last thing in the list, right? But that's the first method that they say. Okay, that's method one. Method two is using a built-in function in Python called max. Okay, max will return the highest number in a list. So if you give it a list, it will return the highest number in the list. So you don't have to use 2 lines of code. If you can solve it in 1 line of code and it's easy to read, try to solve it in 1 line of code. Even if you didn't do a Google search, that information about max is actually in this cheat sheet. So the cheat sheet that we provided to you. So if you look here, we learn about how to sorting a list. We learn about adding, defining a list, accessing a list. The second page of the cheat sheet has a section called simple statistics. So you can find the smallest, finding the minimum value in a list by using min, and finding the maximum value in the list. So the example here is we have a bunch of ages. This list is a bunch of ages, and it will turn, if we want to get the oldest person in this list, we just need to use max. So we can go back over to Thonny, and we can simplify this function even more. We don't even have to sort it because we can just use the max function. So if we say max scores, we know that will return the max score, okay? It'll return the highest score. We didn't have to sort it, and we can just return the highest score. So if I save this, I'll go back over here to the test and run it inside of Thonny instead of running it in PyTest in this terminal. Again, ran 7 tests, everything is okay. All right? So we simplified our solution even more. 1 line of code solved this. Before we had 2 lines of code, and we got it down to 1 line of code here. And we got down to this to 1 line of code. We had 3 lines of code here. We got it down to 2 lines of code by just returning the last item and just sorting. Now we got it down to 1 line of code because we did a little bit of research and we found out that we can just use a built-in function called max to return the highest thing in a list. Okay? Now, there are ways that you could get this down to 1 line of code, but at a certain point, you don't want things to be too short because it'll be hard to read. So I could, if I wanted to, I could use what we learned here in the cheat sheet. We learned that there are lots of different ways to sort, right? So what I could do is use the sorted function instead of using .sort. So I could use the sorted function, and I could say sorted, the name of the list, and then reverse true. Okay? So I could say sorted, the name of the list is scores, and we can say reverse true, just like we did before. And then we can just return the last 3 things of the list. So as I said, we can get this down to 1 line of code for each one of these. However, at this point, getting this down to 1 line of code is just a little bit more difficult to read, because what we're doing is getting this sorted in the reverse order and then returning the first 3 things, which is what we were doing with 2 lines of code, but it's a little bit more difficult to actually understand this code. So you can do something like this if you want, if you understand it. And if you save it and we go back over to PyTest in the terminal here, if we go back over to PyTest in the terminal, we can run the test and we see that it still passed, right? But it's also, if you come back to this code, it might be difficult for you to actually understand what you're trying to do here. So what I suggest you do is reduce the lines of code as much as you can so that you understand them. So I think this is very understandable. This, when we have one line of code here, this is very understandable and readable. If you have one, even though we only have one line of code here and we had 3 before, but this is a little bit more difficult to read or understand what's happening. So 2 lines of code here are fine. So if I go back and I put it back to what it was before, these 2 lines of code to solve this is an acceptable solution. Okay, and that's it. The original solution was fine, but I want you guys to get to the point where you're optimizing your code and writing more efficient code so that you're only writing as much code as you need and no more, and your code is readable. So this is both readable and we're not writing more code than we need to solve the problem. Okay, that's it.